Well, today we're starting on the first of 3 podcasts to consider the theme of morals and markets. The nature of economics is about morality rather than just measurement of statistics and trade cycles and so on. In Cambridge, before Faculty of Economics was set up, it was part of the moral sciences tripos. It was part of economics and philosophy. G.E. Moore was concerned with how to lead a good life, and that influenced what John Maynard Keynes was writing about. But modern economics is often seen as a technical exercise of physics envy, trying to predict the future as if it is invariant, it's highly mathematical, seemingly value neutral. But of course, it's no such thing. Economics embodies views of human motivation, about being individualistic, utility maximising Homo Economicus. Well, in these conversations, I'm going to be exploring with 3 leading scholars different views about economics. Different views of economics are desperately needed after the global financial crisis, particularly as we are facing current challenges of precarity, inequality, and climate change. Well, where better to start than with the Scottish Enlightenment and with Adam Smith. Adam Smith was the author both of The Wealth of Nations and a theory of moral sentiments. He was concerned about a moral capitalism. And I'm going to be exploring some of these issues today with Richard Whatmore, who is Professor of Modern History at the University of St Andrews and co-director of the Institute of Intellectual History. In 2023, Richard published a major book, The End of Enlightenment, Empire, Commerce, Crisis. So I'd like to start off by asking you, Richard, to outline the main arguments of your book.
Thank you. Well, the main argument is that Britain, according to 18th century observers, ought not to have survived as a state, certainly not as a powerful state, because so many Enlightenment, we use the term Enlightenment obviously for this period, luminaries thought that Britain was on the edge of catastrophe, and in their lifetimes they anticipated the very collapse of the polity. And the End of Enlightenment, obviously, which is the title of the book, really explores the sense that things have got so bad, especially in Britain, but also across Europe, that wars of religion have returned with a vengeance, and they're wars of religion in the forms of fanaticism, which have been secularized, so normal politics and economics, characterized by an obsession with reason of state and beggaring your neighbor, expanding your markets, creating corrupt forms of empire. All of those things have come to the fore. And the End of Enlightenment really is the sense that the worst thing possible has happened, which is you've returned to an age of fanaticism, having had the Enlightenment itself, the great achievement of which was to establish toleration and peace. So you could say that fanaticism, in the sense of wars of religion, had been vanquished. But by the time the French Revolution comes along, that's not the case.
Now, you're picking up a point there, perhaps we'll come back to at the very end of our conversation, which is about the return of fanaticism, which has a certain element of current resonance. But before we go there, let me pick up what you just said about the end of Enlightenment in the 18th century. You're feeling that Britain should have collapsed. And I just want to ask you a little bit more about that. And I suppose one way of picking that up initially is debt. Because David Hume was one of the main characters in your book, thought that Britain was going to collapse under the weight of indebtedness, of fighting the wars against France. It was going to corrupt politics. I have a quote from Hume. It might even come from your own book. He said, "It would scarcely be more imprudent to give a prodigal son a credit in every banker's shop in London than to empower a statesman to draw bills upon posterity." And that struck me as a modern historian as being rather similar to what Rishi Sunak said when he became Prime Minister in October 2022. And I quote what Rishi Sunak said: The government I lead will not leave the next generation, your children and grandchildren, with a debt to settle that we were too weak to pay ourselves. So I just wonder if you could explain to me, why did Hume think that this debt would lead to the collapse of the British state, of bankruptcy?
Yes, Hume's an anchoring figure in the End of Enlightenment, and he's an anchoring figure because he really believed in enlightenment, and he thinks that, for example, Britain and France are becoming more alike as states, and you can see enlightenment in the defeat of Louis XIV, the defeat of Louis XIV in war, and his failure to impose a kind of militant Catholicism on the European states. So Hume thought that enlightenment had been experienced, and he defines it really as government of laws rather than men. That is the aspiration. So in the 1740s into the 1750s, he's optimistic about the future. But then he thinks everything goes to hell, for Britain in particular, during the 7 Years' War. And the 7 Years' War is the war where Britain is successful, defeats France and Spain, expands its empire, but at the cost of an exploding debt. And Hume really disliked Chatham, William Pitt the Elder. He was always pleased when he heard that Pitt was suffering from gout. And he felt that Pitt, in our terms, was a populist because he followed public opinion, and he was always looking for the next wheeze to kind of bamboozle the ordinary people. And he was keen to use the debt to expand the markets of the state, to fight wars for empire. And Hume thought that debt-funded war was the worst thing. I mean, he has a wonderful image of, he calls it cudgel playing in a china shop. So in other words, the system of what we would call international relations is so precarious that you can expect to collapse into war because of debt-induced empire building. And I think one of the things that is a key theme for Scottish Enlightenment authors is their belief that small states no longer exist in the modern world, and that we all live in conditions of empire. Certainly if you look back at the small states, which had been independent, very small states, often surrounded by city walls, they've all gone. The republics are in crisis. The Dutch Republic, the Swiss Confederation, Venice, Genoa. The republics are all dying. Poland, Lithuania obviously gets eaten up by the big monarchies from the 1770s. So Hume thinks this turn to debt, it just allows fanatic politicians to go on a war spree and pay for it by ever deeper debt. And this is something that ties together xenophobia, because he thinks the way of justifying the debt is whipping up a kind of xenophobic patriotism in the populace. He also accuses Pitt of doing exactly that. So he's profoundly depressed after the end of the 7 Years' War. Through the 1760s, he gets more and more depressed. The debt continues to increase. He gets more and more furious about it, to the point that he says public credit will destroy the nation, or the nation has to destroy public credit. And so he's as pessimistic as Rishi Sunak and some.
But he wanted then to go for voluntary bankruptcy, is that right?
He certainly thinks it's an option, and it's something that is one of his imagined deaths of Britain, I suppose. Another is civil war, when the populace turned fanatic, imbued with this false sense of the need for liberty, turns against the governors. And another is obviously invasion, defeat in war, and then and the collapse of the state that way. So the apocalyptic Hume, imagining the death of the state that he lives in, obviously he's worried about the consequences for Scotland. The little state successfully turned part of a big state, which is one of the reasons why They do have some vestige of optimism because of the history of Scotland, the history of the Union, that they think very positively about, especially Hume and Smith. But Hume particularly has this catastrophic view of the consequences of public credit.
How does he differ then from Adam Smith? And The Wealth of Nations comes out in 1776, which is also, I believe, the Declaration of Independence. Could you just explain to us how Smith agreed or differed from Hume in his attitude to debt? I mean, like Hume, he didn't like war, didn't like imperialism. So attacks upon imperialism is nothing new in British history, as some members of the right wing of the Conservative Party would argue. Is there imbued within what you're saying, Richard, isn't it?
Yes. When Hume reads the proofs of The Wealth of Nations, he thinks that Smith is justifying Hume's own view of the world, particularly in the description of the mercantile system. So the mercantile system, where you have politicians who are bribed by merchants and rich bankers to pass legislation for their own profit rather than the public good. That is Hume's view of contemporary Britain. Smith provides a language that's then picked up by radicals, Thomas Paine and the next generation. They love Smith and they think Smith's on their side because of this critique of empire. And Smith himself described the book, it's the great attack on the British Empire. But of course, Smith being Smith is much more phlegmatic than Hume. He sees in everything a silver lining because he's obsessed more than Hume with unintended consequences. And it means that he thinks there are always solutions. Obviously, one of his imaginative solutions is to make the capital of the British Empire Philadelphia. How do you satisfy the North Americans who live in a state that Smith can see is going to be greater because of its natural resources? So why not move the capital? Obviously, that's Smith's imagination in action. But it also meant that he's less apocalyptic than Hume. And with regard to debt, he thought it was a problem if it gets truly excessive, but he always thought that there were solutions. And he's not with people like Richard Price in advocating an immediate sinking fund that would pay off the debt and gradually reduce the debt to zero. Smith thinks that is not practical economics, let's say. But he certainly thinks you can pay off the debt through commercial success. And ultimately, I think Smith is one of the people who agrees with everybody about the ills of Britain, but he doesn't think that the death of the state has arrived. I mean, whether it does with the French Revolution, obviously he lives till 1790, is another question. And of course, both Hume and Smith are skeptics. And as skeptics, they had to be worried about their religious opinions. Smith was very concerned about his account of Hume's death because Hume, as a skeptic, had a happy death. And Smith knows he's going to get into a lot of hot water for giving an account of Hume's death that is so positive. So he's outside let's say, the dominant religious cultures that join most people together. He's an outsider in that respect, but he's not apocalyptic in Hume's sense.
Right. So did he have practical solutions? He thought that one way was to, I suppose, abandon the empire, reduce the costs of defence. Another way would be to reform taxation within Britain so it was more legitimate, so people were happy to pay their taxes without rising up in revolt. Is that right?
I think that is right. Getting rid of empire is a very significant notion that is very popular. Obviously, we see decolonization as part of our political conversations. But in the late 18th century, they want to put it into practice by genuinely getting Britain out of the American colonies, obviously the 13 colonies that are lost, but Smith and some of his supporters are very worried. Friends like Edmund Burke are very worried about the situation in India. They think it's a corrupt empire.
Yeah.
They, obviously in Burke's case, can't stand Warren Hastings, probably ought to have blamed Robert Clive more, but they still want the British out of India. And they think they can imagine a Britain as a weaker polity. And as a weaker polity, but commercially more successful, less embroiled in war, less involved in international politics, Smith can certainly see a way of paying the debt and of reorganising taxes so that they're fairer, I suppose, would be what he ultimately believed in. And it's one of the main speculations of The Wealth of Nations is ultimately how you pay your debt in a fair way without damaging your economy.
Well, that also has some relevance for today's debates. But before we come to the present, let me pick up what you were saying earlier on in talking about your book. You say Hume thought that Britain was going to collapse. Well, we know it didn't. It became economically successful. There's the Industrial Revolution. There's the defeat of Napoleon by 1815. Britain goes on to be the workshop of the world, the great power. So I just wonder if we could reflect upon why the disaster, the apocalypse that Hume was talking about didn't come about. I mean, debt went up to about 200% of GDP by the end of the Napoleonic Wars. I went back there again during the two World Wars. So why was it that Britain was able to survive that level of debt, whereas France in the 18th century was constantly defaulting? So it was the French who had the serious financial issues, and not Britain. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because people living in the 1780s, if they'd been asked, where is revolution going to occur, they would have said London rather than Paris. Again, you've got George III becoming seriously ill and being accused of going mad. You've got debt. You've finally had defeat in war by the French, the Dutch, and the Spanish. And therefore Britain looks as if it's in a terribly parlous state. And then in the French Revolution, you have the outbreak of what you might call liberty wars, because a new free state emerges, that of revolutionary France, and it goes to war to the death with Britain. And the notion of free states battling each other and funding the autocracies to provide mercenaries or to fight alongside them characterizes this period. And it's very significant. It's actually, Britain doesn't just survive economically, exactly as you've said. In some ways, if you look at it historically, it's even more remarkable, because I said earlier that free states, which are usually associated with the small states, and the republics, especially of Europe, those which have survived since the Renaissance, I mentioned Venice and Genoa, more newer republics, the Dutch Republic, they all disappear. So republicanism is in decline. Free states look as if they're endangered species. And a lot of people thought Britain's going to be the last one. It's a world of very large states, civilized monarchies like France, possibly Prussia, possibly even Russia, if you've got a reforming Tsar or Tsarina. Then the world is not going to have space for a commercial state like Britain. And yet, by the early 19th century, you get the birth of liberalism.
Yep.
And what liberals believe is Britain is the model state. And people who had been Republicans during the French Revolution, Madame de Staël, Benjamin Constant, Simone de Sismondi, they'd been French Republicans, and then they become Anglophile. Britain is the model. That's what liberalism meant to that generation. But the problem is it still has the mercantile system. So for that first generation, who I think live after Enlightenment, people like Jeremy Bentham, Jean-Baptiste Say in particular, still obsessed with the British debt, thinks it's going to collapse.
Yep.
Bentham too. They're very pessimistic about the future. So in a sense, the worst possible thing happened to modern Europe, which is Britain survived because people are so pessimistic about it. They're so negative about it as a state. In Hume's terms, fanaticism and debt wins wars. So you might have liberty, but it's a fanatic liberty dedicated to the pursuit of war and empire, and therefore it's dreadful. But Bonaparte is defeated. And Bonaparte had his own mercantile system, the continental system. It looks like mercantile systems are the only game in town. And the 19th century story, I mean, it's actually I'd actually like your view on it, because in a sense, from the perspective of the Enlightenment luminaries, for Britain to become a dominant free state, that means the world's completely changed. It means Smith's world, Hume's world, they wouldn't have expected the history to pursue the course that it did. They'd be really shocked at the rise of Britain, the dominion of Britain. But at the same time, they would have called it a mercantile system, said the economy was a mercantile system. But it seems to me, and this is the question to you really, that there's a new British Enlightenment, which is reforms to the economy particularly, coping with the debt problem, again, becoming the workshop of the world, undergoing, obviously, the Industrial Revolution. And that amounts to a British Enlightenment that is actually called a British Enlightenment by the generation of the 20s and 30s that we'll probably come back to in a bit.
I think that's right. So going back to Smith and the idea of having a fair taxation system, I think that's one thing which does happen after the Napoleonic Wars. 1830s, 1840s, with Peel and Gladstone, the idea that the tax system should not be seen as a way of ripping off the poor people and allowing the rich to escape taxation. I think that was something which Gladstone was very concerned about. I mean, he went to Naples at one point and saw what would happen there if you had a system which was not seen as fair and legitimate. Peel also, I suppose. The 1851 Great Exhibition is a sign of that, where the masses could take part in the nature of commerce. They can share within that. I think that if the Gladstonian fiscal constitution is a way of creating that legitimate system of taxation. You have budget surpluses. Any surplus must go to pay off the debt. Of course, you've got growth. But I don't think it's growth which really leads to reduction of the debt, because growth was still lower than the interest rate in the 19th century. You don't have inflation, because the level of prices at the end of the Napoleonic Wars was more or less the same as at the beginning of the First World War. So it's really that having the budget surplus, constraining the state, which I think is really important. After the Second World War, it's different. It's not budget surpluses, it's growth being faster than interest rates. But I think that there's a very interesting way in which what Gladstone was doing, John Stuart Mill and so on were doing, was picked up in the late 1950s and 60s by the Virginia School of Economics, by James Buchanan, because they said Gladstone had it right. What you need to have is budget surpluses, not to have this debt building up upon the on the state and sucking it out. Of course, their concern was not war; it was the cost of social security. So the rhetoric changes there. But let's move on from this debate about debt, which is still very much in the fore at the moment. I mean, should we be so concerned about this debt to GDP ratio? We're just assuming this as the language to use, and I would argue that it's not. So Sunak and Hume were concerned about passing on debt to the future. Shouldn't we be concerned about passing on assets to the future? Should we be thinking about a balance sheet of the state? What are the assets which the state owns as against the liabilities it has? Is that a better way of thinking about it than Sunak? Not saying let's not pass on debt to the future, but let's be concerned about passing on assets to the future, letting the future generation have as good a state of the planet, of the resources, as we have inherited ourselves.
Yes, and I actually think if he'd lived, obviously it's entirely counterfactual, then Hume would have seen that being the very clever man that he was, and that the world had changed, he would still have been worried about it. Of course, Hume always said, and it's something that characterises Smith's view as well, that you can't see economics and the economics of an individual state outside, broader geopolitics, as we would call it. And if your state is a world power, as Britain becomes, then it's in a very different circumstance to a smaller rising power, a declining power. So the geopolitical circumstances, I think they would have said, of 19th century Britain means that you don't have to be worried. In the present, again, what are they obsessed with in the 18th century? They're obsessed with the collapse of small states, that we don't live in small states. We all live in large states. We all live in empires. And therefore, you have to worry, what's the dominant empire? And we've been talking about the period when Britain was the dominant empire, and a lot of people are positive about that at the time because they think Britain will stop the autocrats from cutting up Europe and will fight for liberty somehow and will maintain free states as the dominant form of state. And if you look at this period historically, it's a couple of hundred years plus. I mean, longer if you consider Britain having been a free state since 1688. Then free states have risen, have become more and more dominant. And now we're at a kind of crisis point where we're uncertain again how to maintain them. So the geopolitics of debt, I think, are significant.
Yeah.
And the question becomes, a question that you would naturally ask is, who holds your debt? Who's going to call on you for your debt? And if you are passing a balance sheet on, then who owns that balance sheet? Yeah. Because is it, corporate actors that have no commitment to your polity, or are they fully invested, let's say, because they want to draw profit, but also they are invested in a stronger sense. So in that kind of balance sheet, which actually brings to me the parallel with people like Hayek and von Mises in the 1920s, when they're obsessed with business cycles and predicting the future of markets, boom and bust, so you can prevent the kind of crises that have exploded at the end of the First World War. But what they wanted was absolute transparency about ownership.
Yes.
Who owns the companies? Who owns the stocks? What are they doing? What are they likely to do into the future? So I think a kind of investigative balance sheet that I'm sure, I can't imagine Richie Sunak being positive about. I think that's exactly what Hume would have called for. It's what Smith would have called for. It's also what Hayek, Buchanan, hopefully too, would have called for.
Yes. Yeah, because one of the issues which has been debated in issue over debt is, I say, who owns the debt. Just as some people, debt didn't matter if it was domestically owned, because you're just passing it from one pocket to the other, from the left hand to the right hand. Because if it's owned overseas, obviously by shadowy international organisations, then where is the money going? Is it taking money out of the state or putting it in? So these issues of debt were important in the 18th century. They're important now. But let's move on to another issue which would always come to mind when we talk about Adam Smith, the invisible hand. And you mentioned Hayek there as well. Well, today in Britain, in debates over politics, one voice which is often heard, along with the Institute of Economic Affairs, is the Adam Smith Institute, which is on the right, sort of like free marketeers of a quite extreme sort. But do they really understand what Adam Smith was himself arguing? As I said at the beginning, he wrote both The Wealth of Nations and A Theory of Moral Sentiments, and very often they refer to the Adam Smith problem as if these are in tension. But is that really the case? Was there an inner contradiction within Adam Smith? or was he really arguing for a form of capitalism, which I said earlier on was a moral capitalism, and the Adam Smith Institute misunderstands what he was doing?
Well, Adam Smith is probably the most lauded of 18th century luminaries. I can't imagine anybody else. You know, Rousseau, Voltaire, Montesquieu. Nobody comes close. I think Kant, I suppose, is the only comparable figure in the history of philosophy, obviously. But it also means inevitably, which Smith himself recognised, that he was misunderstood in his own time, and I don't think he would be surprised at being misunderstood in the present. Of course, Smith is ultimately worried that commerce is a force for chaos. And it's a force for chaos because it turns the world upside down. Now, if you're an 18th century Scot and you're seeing the rapid economic development of Scotland and the process of urbanisation, and you don't like the feudal heritage, and you don't like what you see as the vulgar, rude, crass, barbaric cultures of the clan chiefs and some of the leading landlords, then you're very pleased that commerce is gonna turn the world upside down. But you don't think that it can be relied upon as a moral force. And this distinction that's sometimes made between the Smith of sympathy of the theory of moral sentiments and the Smith of self-interest of the wealth of nations, it's a completely false distinction. There's no Adam Smith problem. He simply thought that the world is very, very complex. To understand it, you have to consider what we would call economics, we would call philosophy, we would call moral philosophy and morality, we would call theology, and we would call international relations. You have to understand them all together. There's no market solution to any problem. To say that there was a market solution to a problem would really be to say you're relying on providence alone, which is the notion behind the hidden hand.
Yeah.
But then Smith, as a skeptic, was unlikely to believe in such forms of providence. And always with Smith, I think you have to say, well, what did it look like in practice? And Smith in his own time definitely does not say, put your foot on the commercial accelerator and watch all your problems be solved. Because actually the commercial society that he was most worried about was the mercantile system, which was exactly what his friend Hume thought. Corrupt forms of empire building can ruin domestic political relationships. The pursuit of profit, domestically or abroad, can also mean you have a corrupt group of politicians. Smith had no faith in politicians at all. And he was worried about projectors who sell you moonshine, who say there's an easy solution to any problem. He was worried about enthusiasts, people who tell the people, oh, just follow me. You know, God is talking to me and all you need to do is follow. He's worried about all of those people. And actually, he is ultimately pessimistic, although he does see also the power of commerce. It does turn poor states like Scotland into rich states. That is the miracle, and it's connected to liberty. So he's an advocate of free states, he's an advocate of commerce, but not in the way that he's caricatured in the present, where he would say that's only a partial field that in order to understand its consequences, you have to see it in relationship to philosophy, to morals, to international relations, and of course to history.
Yeah. So, I mean, he talks about the self-love of the butcher and the baker in making a profit. But doesn't he also there say, well, actually, you're not going to be able to sell your bread or your whatever unless you engage the sympathy of the person to whom you are selling it. So he's talking about engagement with the concerns of the other person, is he not? And saying that to be happy ourselves, we want others to be happy, and we need to regard our actions, always self-observing, isn't he? And analysing. So it's about the markets being conscious action and looking for the happiness of others. Is that fair?
Certainly, you're not going to get healthy commercial relationships when you're dealing with fanatics.
No.
And I think that for Smith and Hume and for this generation of Enlightenment figures, they thought about the wars of religion in the same way that, our generation thought about the Second World War. It simply shapes everything. You're worried about going back to it. You need to avoid it at all costs. And Hume and Smith think the same about the wars of religion. So did most of their contemporaries. And they're worried about fanaticism breaking out. And there's no question you can have fanatic markets. Obviously Smith doesn't like slavery.
No.
He thinks it's irrational economically, but he also does think it's fanatic. And I suppose you could say its moral consequences are going to corrupt the market wherever you have that form of trade. So it is certainly the case that Smith's sense of the future of markets, when you're taking it at a national level, also means in relation to all other states, it means at an imperial level. So speculation about the future, you just can't say there's one solution, one easy solution. Yeah. He would say that the person who said that was a projector. You must not trust them.
Right. So if somebody peddles you the idea that the only way to have economic growth is to cut taxes, they're a projector, don't believe them. Life is more complicated. I'm just trying to work through then the Adam Smith Institute and what they might say then. Surely Adam Smith is arguing against their proposition. Isn't he arguing that the way to prosperity is through high wages? If you have workers who have higher wages, they can save more, they can look to the future. And if they're saving more, there's more investment. And if there's more investment, there's more productivity. So rather than the idea of simply of cutting taxes as the solution to economic growth, if Smith were alive now and taking part in political debates, might he not argue that the best thing to do is to get rid of inequality to increase the wages of workers, so the workers therefore are not so dependent upon short-term borrowing to make ends meet, that they have more prosperity, they can save more, they can invest more, that they become more productive, they're better educated. Is that, if we could imagine Smith arguing, is that what he's arguing about? High saving, a sense of prudence, a foresightedness.
Yeah, I like that, and it shows the extent to which Hume and Smith, in a sense, they believe that the battle that is perpetually being fought is a battle to establish civilization.
Yes.
And if you have to be worried about the people turning fanatic, and that might be in the form of, unemployed workers in urban settings who are whipped up into a mob, and you have to remember the contemporary example which Edward Gibbon was present at with the Gordon riots, the anti-Catholic riots in 1780, where Gibbon says, it's 20,000 Puritans emerging from their graves. So again, the people in arms can turn fanatic. You have to worry about them. The later worry is impoverished, unemployed people en masse embracing fanatic doctrines. And the example would be, radical forms of revolutionary socialism. That's something that Hayek is clearly obsessed with, the notion of workers turning fanatic because they're persuaded by demagogues to pursue a fanatic ideology that ultimately is selling you moonshine because you can't transform states into a utopia so easily. So I think that the worries about the people in the 18th century are paralleled by the worries about especially the unemployed in the 20th century. And again, the theme is create civilization. Civilization ultimately means security of property, high wages, a civilized life for people. Ultimately, one of Smith's major disciples was Jean-Baptiste Say, who lived through the French Revolution. He becomes a revolutionary Republican. He calls himself a Republican, even though the French revolutionary experiment failed, and he dies in 1832. But Say said the only lesson of the French Revolution after experiencing it is the need for moderate wealth. If you don't have moderate wealth, and ultimately Say also believed in a high-wage economy exactly on Smith's lines, because he thinks he's really updating Smith for a new century. That is the key. It's a defense of civilization. And civilization in big states, and that's the great challenge, to have it in a big state, whereas in the past you've only been able to have it, the argument went liberty plus commercial success in small states.
Right, so Smith then is providing us lessons against populism today as well as against the threat of revolution in the era in which he was living. I'm going to have a quote from Smith, which perhaps is pertinent for today's issues. He said, "The high price of labour is to be considered not merely as a proof of the general opulence of society which can afford to pay well all those whom it employs. It is to be regarded as what constitutes the essence of public opulence." So giving better wages, better conditions to people who are suffering from precarious employment would be his solution, not that is put forward in his name by the Adam Smith Institute.
Certainly, I think that's a very good definition of civilization. And that's the key really to Smith and Hume. We've discussed how they differ, but Smith has a powerful sense, especially of looking at Scotland, of a state that could have descended into acute poverty and barbarism, where he's pleased with the union. He thinks the union's a huge success, where you're experiencing a contemporary civil war with the Jacobites, who are a threat until 1745. And it's a very popular ideology. So he lives through this period where civilization is threatened, and he wants to defend it. But he knows it's going to be difficult, and there are no easy solutions. And the world is always marked by unintended consequences. And for the most part, you cannot trust politicians because so many of them are projectors.
Okay. Well, let's conclude this part of the discussion by just asking a little bit about this idea that's often put forward of the invisible hand. Emma Rothschild, a leading scholar on economic sentiments, talking about many of the people you've been mentioning, Richard, said it was just a mild and ironic joke. So is she right? How do you read the idea of Adam Smith, or Adam Smith's invisible hand, which I don't think actually says very much about in the book, in Wealth of Nations?
No, he doesn't. Famously, there's one quote. At the moment, there's a debate about where was it in the book. So is there a kind of hidden message from Smith that it's in the centre, and you will need to read from that it's significant. But I think, Emma's Rothschild's work is outstanding, and she's right, because as she reads Smith, he's interested in guilds, he's interested in the civilization around him, and the notion of taking one observation about how markets work. Markets in some certain circumstances, it's marvelous if they operate as if by a hidden hand. And I think that it's legitimate to say that Smith is an author of that point of view. But then to say that Smith's defining recommendation that defines a philosophy called classical liberalism that can be taken from 18th century circumstances and used as the basis for policy platforms in the present, I think that's nuts.
Yeah, but doesn't Emma, though, point to a number of ways in which Smith uses the idea of an invisible hand? One is, if you like, credulous people in the distant past who thought that thunderstorms were caused by the invisible hand of Jupiter, or earthquakes caused by some invisible agent, that it could be about unscrupulous rich landowners exploiting people, making them produce luxury goods. The people who produce those are, if you like, being guided by an invisible hand. I think the title of her chapter on this is called something like, a quote from Macbeth, isn't it? Thy bloody and invisible hand. Somebody stabbing you in the back is another. So he's not exactly saying that the invisible hand is a good thing, is he?
I think he would say it's a good thing in certain circumstances,
right.
But it's everything. These Hume and Smith and the Enlightenment generations are obsessed with Montesquieu in The Spirit of the Laws, 1748. Things happen differently in different circumstances.
Yep.
And circumstances are conditioned by history above all.
Yep.
What works in one context won't work in another.
Absolutely.
And you have to apply that to everything, including the operation of the hidden hand. And of course, because humans are humans, they can be seduced by fanatic doctrines. And they all look back to the wars of religion because they think what happened then, enthusiasts turned societies upside down, abandoned notion of law, and created circumstances of crisis because they were certain that God was talking to them.
Yeah.
And whether it's in a physical manifestation of a volcano or of a significant weather event, or whether you genuinely believe that God is talking to you, that can make you go turn enthusiast. From enthusiast, you become fanatic, and then you cannot be trusted.
Yes. So I think that what we're talking about here, Richard, is the way in which economics must be understood within geopolitics. It must be understood in terms of philosophy. And you're also saying in terms of history. It all depends. Context matters, which is perhaps something which economists are not so good at. So think again, going back to debt, the idea that came out during the time of austerity recently about the 90% rule. If debt goes above 90%, you have a 1% drop in growth rate. And they produce that as a sort of physical theory, if you like, as if it's part of astrophysics. And we would say as historians, no, that's not true. That the Second World War had a 200% debt GDP ratio. There was rapid growth. First World War, 200% GDP ratio, not rapid growth. So it all depends upon circumstances. But let me move on a little bit to Hayek, who you mentioned. I mean, Hayek is often seen as the person who is arguing for the economy as a spontaneous order in which people are unthinking. They're acting on, I suppose, the invisible hand in a way. It's a spontaneous phenomenon based upon ignorance, yet produces order and prosperity. I mean, is Smith like Hayek, unlike Hayek? What's your view on that?
I'm going to say something radical, which is I think Smith and Hayek are pretty identical.
Really?
In that
That's not what Emma Rothschild says.
Well, I think they're both defenders of civilization. And there are so many parallels. If you think of Hayek experiencing, in a sense, what might have been a future for Scotland. If you look at the Austro-Hungarian Empire, obviously he's born at Vienna at the end of the 19th century. He thinks it's wonderful. He thinks he lives in conditions of liberty. He sees his state go from a large state to a tiny state after the First World War. He sees the rise of barbarism. He's such a patriot that he's fought on the Italian front for Austro-Hungary in the First World War. By 1938, he's British, and he thinks that he's had to abandon his world because it's barbarous. He's seen the rise of fascism at first hand, and lots of his friends are going to be murdered by the Nazis as Jewish people. And that's something that he abhors naturally. And in a sense, he's fighting for civilization in a similar way to Smith. I think in Hayek's case, Hayek lives a long life, and after, in the war years, significantly spends a huge amount of time trying to track down the letters of John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor.
Really?
That matters enormously to Hayek because he wants to show that there are forms of a positive relationship between the sexes, between men and women, under conditions of liberalism, 19th century liberalism, because the socialists among his contemporaries are saying you can only get equality between men and women under conditions of socialism or communism. So the relationship between John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor is really important to Hayek. But it's also the case that actually he's at the LSE and then he leaves for Chicago, as you know, in 1950, and he stays to 1960 and he writes the Constitution of Liberty. For Hayek, in a sense, he doesn't just seek to collect and then publish the letters of John Stuart Mill. He sees himself as a John Stuart Mill figure. And obviously John Stuart Mill saw himself as a Smith figure because he knows that they're defenders of civilization. Yep. Circumstances have changed so that how you defend civilization is different. And the great difference for Hayek is the dominion of the United States as a world power. So how are economies going to work not under British dominion? Because Hayek thought British civilization, and he spends a huge amount of time as what you might call an intellectual historian, tracing the lineage from Hume, from Smith, he's obsessed with both of them, into the 19th century. And he says, Hayek famously says, in The Road to Serfdom, why did the First World War break out? Because Britain ceased to be the dominant culture. And the British themselves are to blame because they let French socialism and German idealism not only become dominant culturally, but it made the British themselves insecure. And more British people thought, German culture's the future, or turned to kind of originally French forms of socialism or Marxist socialism. And that meant that the British, for Hayek, saved the world in a sense for liberty in the First World War, but the price was the collapse of Britain as a polity. And the United States is totally different. It's very significant the Constitution of Liberty is dedicated to the American civilization.
Right.
So for me, it's interesting that if Smith is looking at this problem of a small state joining a large state, Hayek is interested in a great empire, Britain, turning itself into a small state, the consequences of that when you love that culture. Hayek said he's most happy when he goes to the LSE in the 1930s and 1940s, more happy than at any other point of his life, lives in the United States, becomes depressed, and is worried about the future in the context of the civilization that he knows is the dominant civilization, which is that of the United States. So I think for Hayek, the big difference would have been obvious to Smith, which is the difference between a world economy in US-dominated circumstances as opposed to a world economy in British-dominated circumstances. They're both free states, so that's a good thing. There's a story about liberty to be told, but it means you're in very different circumstances.
All right, that's you said a radical view. Let me push back a little bit. I'm not disagreeing with you, but I wonder if you provide a complete story there. Because could you say that to Hayek, the economy is about unconscious, blind, imperfectly understood action by individuals, whereas to Smith, going to what we were saying earlier on about sympathy and understanding and conscious knowledge, it's the market is something which in which you're conscious of your own ends, you're evaluating what you're doing, you're evaluating what other people want to do. So is there really a difference there, do you think, in that respect?
I don't actually, because I think that for both of them, unintended consequences play such a major role. They also think that human beings, they're both Humeans, reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. And any rational projector who says, by this rule of reason, we will reform the world and create a utopia. They're the people you need to really worry about. Obviously, they have different people in mind. Smith thinks people like Richard Price are people to worry about. He also thinks figures who are governing the empire you need to worry about. For Hayek, it's the people who believe in the rule of reason, which he associates with technocratic solutions to problems, which he sees most in the history of socialism, particularly the Saint-Simonians, and he thinks they played an incredible role defining socialism in the 19th century and then into the 20th century. And he's worried about civilizations that think that there are technological solutions to problems. And if you rely on technology alone, you might well be creating a hell around you and losing civilization itself. So again, I think there's a real parallel between them.
Okay, so they both dislike planners. The state is all-seeing and all-knowledgeable.
They definitely don't trust states because they don't trust politicians, and they don't believe that states can ever be seen as individual agents because they conceive of them within a global framework, because that's what you get with commercial societies. So you have to take the geopolitics seriously too.
So if you go back to the 1930s, I think I'm right in saying that both Robbins, who brought Hayek to the LSE, and Hayek himself believed in federal states, where that would mean that if you have a federal Europe, the French couldn't be imposing tariff duties so readily because they'd be constrained because the British would be part of that system. Is that right?
It is, and it's coming back to kind of Smith's notion of a kind of a federal British Empire.
Yes, it is.
The solution to the problem of the American Revolution as he lived through it. For both of them, though, for Hayek as well, there's a big difference between having an idea and putting it into practice. And I think Hayek always thought, even if you have a really good idea, it's going to be messed up. And that's why he's so pessimistic, going through his periods of depression in his life. And he thinks, often in interviews, especially towards the end of his life, he's saying, if we last another 20 years. Yeah. So in a sense, he's as apocalyptic as Hume.
Yes. Okay. Well, I can't resist asking you this, because he wrote to Mrs. Thatcher. And Mrs. Thatcher, it is alleged, when she became Prime Minister, slammed down a copy of Hayek's book. I can't remember which one it was now. I said, that's what we believe. What was his view about that, about what Mrs. Thatcher was doing?
Well, of course, what everybody says about Hayek is that he was the most polite, civilized gentleman anybody could ever meet. So he would have been polite. What he would have thought in practice, especially not only Thatcher's creation of the lineage relying on him, but again, as you'll know, she sends him a letter when he's 90. She's been in power for 10 years. And she says, we couldn't have done it without you. Again, the implication being that she's followed Hayek's script. And of course, in some respects, what was Hayek worried about? He was worried about fanatic unions of workers pressuring politicians to pass legislation for their interest rather than the public good. But what does he worry about the future of democracies in particular? He says that the worry is that democracies become all political organizations for paying off interest groups. Yeah. And I think he would have concluded that you pay off interest groups in the form of corporations or the contemporary version of the mercantile system as time has passed to a greater extent, certainly in a lot of countries, than you're paying off the unions. So I think there are aspects of Thatcher's policies that, of course, he would have been very positive about, and I'm sure he was. But there's much more to it with Hayek, and he never thinks that they're creating a utopia. The association of Hayek with, Fukuyama's End of History.
Ridiculous.
Yeah, ridiculous.
Okay, so he thinks we want to defeat the barons within the trade union movement, but also we want to defeat the barons within the City of London, the financial service sector. They're all interests.
Yes, and also because they can foster forms of xenophobic nationalism. Because, again, what is Hayek's fundamental point? He hates National Socialism. And he thinks National Socialism, obviously manifested by Hitler, is nationalism and socialism together. And you have to worry about both of them. And I think actually when Thatcher and Reagan particularly played the nationalist card, I think that would have horrified Hayek because he thinks it directly leads to war, to xenophobic populations, persecuting his friends who are Jewish, persecuting other minorities, persecuting people like him, people who've had to experience exodus and move from a place where he's fought against Britain as a loyal, patriotic Austro-Hungarian young man to being British, a generation later, and being welcomed and looked after. And he thought that was marvellous. And he worries with nationalism, that's exactly what you're going to lose.
Well, let's conclude by asking a question that arises at the end of your book. At the very beginning, I said I would hold over the debate over the future till the end. So at the end of your book, you say this, let me quote. Once again, we live in a world that has suffered an end of enlightenment. As the strategies formulated after 1945 to prevent civil and international violence, fanaticism and chaos from breaking out have gradually failed or been abandoned. So you're saying, look, we're back here. You're being perhaps a bit apocalyptic yourself, Richard. I've written a book recently which deals with that creation of a sort of rules-based order after the Second World War. The International Monetary Fund, the GATT, the United Nations, they all seem to be collapsing. Do you have any views for us now about how we're going to escape from this return of fanaticism? Or are you as apocalyptic as Hume was in the late 18th century, and as Hayek, indeed?
I think anybody who buys my book ought to also buy yours, Martin, because it's a marvellous book. And in terms of explaining fanaticism after the Second World War, then it's marvellous, and understanding Hayek and lots of other people. But I'm not avoiding the question by praising you. I think that our time can be characterized as another outbreak of what would have been called in the past wars of religion. And it's interesting that the kind of technological revolution that we're going through, which again, some people think it's akin to the invention of the printing press. The Gutenberg press, what's it used for? It's used for people to turn themselves into religious radicals and to justify the burning of other human beings, ultimately, which in those days was the worst thing they could imagine human beings doing to each other. Obviously, we've invented lots of other things since that are potentially worse than being burned alive in front of a mob. But in our day, we're going through a period of cultural fanaticism, and I think the best thing to do is to realise where we are. Yeah. And I think that's what history does very well, because you can see we're in a crisis of the free states again. We're in very different circumstances because probably we're living through the decline of US dominion. Certainly it's different to the way it was. It's happened incredibly fast. What has commerce done? It's turned a poor state, China, into a super rich state. Under a very short period of time. So the notion of this being a calm American century akin to the British 19th century, again, lots of people would say, of course it wasn't calm because these free states are actually imperial democracies, and imperial democracies are as bad as fascist totalitarian democracies. But I would say people who believe that have to ask the question whether they might be projectors themselves, because if you want to create a utopia, you have to explain in contemporary terms with reference to contemporary examples, how are you going to do it? And I think in our times we have a turn against history, which particularly worries about me. And in a sense, my pessimism about the present is more to do with the turn against history. Oh, we're living in new times, the past doesn't matter. Whereas for me, since the end of Enlightenment, there have been at least two further ends of Enlightenment, one around the First World War, Second World War, and then now. And we haven't descended into war, God forbid. If we do, usually if we survive it, it acts as a purgative force, and people have gone to hell, and therefore all of a sudden there are reformist impulses. This time we can't afford to do it. So it means our practical options are constrained. And the other big difference, which is a parallel with the end of the 18th century rather than the 19th century into the 20th century, is we no longer have any faith in major ideologies. You know, liberalism's in decline or dead, socialism. Whereas in the 20s and 30s, you know, there's Marxists abound, and you've got the Soviet Union as a potential option for a free state. There's talk about a Pan-African Union as a new model of a free state. You know, again, coming back to your point about federal alternatives, we don't have that now. You know, so like the end of the 18th century during the French Revolution, people think every existing ideology has failed. That's where we are now. And that, again, is why I am worried. Not that I don't think there are solutions, because if you are in a free state, you have to be very grateful for it. They're the places that people are not leaving. They don't want to live somewhere else. People want to live in free states. And as long as you've not got a completely corrupt economy, mercantile system, where politicians are passing legislation for the profit of the masters who are going to soon employ them once they leave office, getting away from that, then, of course, as we both would argue, you can do things with economics, you can do things with politics, you can create a better world. So I've not lost hope completely.
Well, I'm pleased that we ended on an optimistic note, and I think about Adam Tooze's a view that we're living in a polycrisis. There's so many different crises going on. You know, conflict with Russia, the issue about China, will they invade Taiwan, problems in the Middle East, problems of populism, of inequality, of precarity. These are massive issues. And I suppose what you're saying, Richard, is like Adam Smith: don't trust anybody who thinks they've got a simple answer, whether it be Nigel Farage or Marine Le Pen or Liz Truss or take whatever name you wish. So we've got to be, as historians, we have to be thinking all the time about what is possible, what the context is, rather than coming up with some grand, I don't know, a solution which is pure fantasy of a utopia.
Certainly, so thank you. Don't trust projectors.
Don't trust projectors. Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you.